Hello, this is Claire Sand, and thank you for listening to my talk. I'm pretty excited about the virtual IFT, as we all are. And this talk will be talking about leveraging protein waste with novel products, processing, and packaging solutions. Thank you for listening to my talk. We're going to be talking through three different areas. How more sustainable systems get protein to consumers, some case studies on kidney beans, and we're also going to talk about market and consumer drivers for less waste of alternative proteins. Here's the key takeaways. We'll review this at the end as well. This is a little bit about me. I think you're going to get a copy of these slides, so I'm not going to spend too much time on me, but I get to write the packaging column every month in food technology, and I really enjoy writing it and enjoy collaborating with other authors as well on the column. And I'm also an adjunct professor and am also run two consulting companies now. Let's talk about alternative proteins. One of the interesting things about them with packaging is the environmental impact is different. This is really interesting data from Por and Namasak, I believe it's pronounced. And if you haven't read this paper, I really encourage it. If you're really passionate about food waste and the role of our entire food system on impacting the environment, it's a wonderful paper. What's really amazing about it is they share the data, and there's 2 giant Excel files that you can access. So it's pretty neat. Let's look at packaging here, right, which is the maroon one, and then processing is the, I guess you would say beige one, dark beige one, and we also have crop production and livestock and aquaculture and things like that. So let's look at pulses. If you look at the difference between pulses and, let's say, beef, right above each other, we can see that the environmental impact, and this is, again, a percent share. And so it's really important to understand this data. So it's the percent share of greenhouse gas emissions. So when we look at things like tofu and pulses, we see larger impacts with packaging in terms of percent of the overall greenhouse gas emissions. And we see large impacts of livestock and aquaculture, it would make sense, with beef, but very small environmental impacts of packaging on a comparative level. What that means then is that we have an opportunity in packaging to make the packaging for pulses as sustainable as the pulses themselves, and that we also have an opportunity, a very small one in processing, but we have a larger opportunity in processing with products like tofu to decrease the environmental impact. And so I was just talking specifically about greenhouse gas emissions, but we can look at the environmental impacts of terrestrial acidification, eutrophication, all sorts of other parameters. This data is similar to the previous data, but again, it's the same citation. The important thing with those two is that alternative proteins actually have alternative impacts. So the environmental impacts of proteins are different, and that's important when we look at things like the value chain. When we look at that, then we know that the solutions to reduce protein and make proteins more sustainable are then we have different solutions just simply because our inputs are entirely different, right? And so this is an example of just different value chain parameters and how they vary from one category to the other. So we have product degradation causes, which are different in alternative protein versus non-alternative proteins. We also have packaging properties. We have packaging and handling that's very different. For example, HACCP procedures are extremely different. In distribution and retail, we need time temperature monitoring with some proteins, but we don't with other alternative proteins, depending on how they're processed. And then also, Consumers handle them very different. They may freeze beef and things like that, but they may not freeze alternative proteins. And so it's important to not just copy what is done in the protein industry with alternative proteins. We really need to take a step back and think about how we package them, how we process them, and can do that in a more sustainable way. So let's look at some case studies on alternative proteins. This is what my company does. We look at food waste and packaging waste, and we combine it all together to try to get a more sustainable food system. And we use packaging solutions and product and process solutions and some value chain solutions. This is output from a company that we work with called AURI, and they stand for Agricultural Utilization Research Initiative. It's a mouthful, but an amazing organization in Minnesota, and I'm a big fan of them. And they hired us to basically map food waste in Minnesota for 6 different products, and we had a good time doing that. We identified and quantified a whole bunch of viable, 287 viable product process and packaging and system solutions in the value chain. We went from the farms all the way through to consumers, and we identified 7 food products. And as you can see, a lot of the food waste happens at the consumers, but there was also a lot at the farm level. This whole case study involves work that we did for AURI. This is quantifying a lot of it, and really what we did is blending research databases. So in order to identify which 7 products to focus on, we looked at, are they even relevant to Minnesota? For example, we don't grow a lot of oranges in Minnesota. That's where I'm living now, but we do grow a lot of apples, and we do grow quite a bit of kidney beans, corn, and things like that. And so we focused on products that were grown a lot in Minnesota, but also had a significant amount of waste. One of the products we looked at was sugar beets, which is interesting because we experience a lot of food waste some years because it's a bad sugar beet crop, weather issues, all sorts of things. But some years, very little waste. So it's highly variable. And the same thing is true with apples as well as for grapes that we use for wine. So with the AURI team, we identified 12 specific food loss and waste opportunities, and then we moved forward and kind of work through next steps to come up with solutions. So this is the process that we used, and so this was a pretty good process. And the reason I'm sharing the case study is that I think it is a good process if you're interested in doing this type of analysis. We have the total pounds of food waste up at the top, the percent of total food waste, and then this kind of walks us through different solutions. So if you can see on the left-hand side, we looked at where the food waste actually occurred. So this is at farms, why it's happening, what's done now, what are some co-product solutions, some process solutions, some packaging solutions, and some system solutions. So we walked through this and analyzed the entire process. And this is one for farms. Up at the top of this one too, we also talked about key stakeholders and supporters for future funding, which is relevant because building the business case for food waste is really best built when you can show that there's money to be made from food waste, which is trending now in a lot of organizations. But one of the things we wanted to do was not just make ingredients that perhaps the value proposition and the costs wouldn't align with what industry wanted. We wanted to actually make products from these. So again, walking through this, this is a waste that occurs at the cannery, pretty low amount of waste at the cannery, about 5%. But the neat thing about this is the opportunity here was to combine the wastewater from the plant, and you can see it's 0% food waste up in the NA, because that's sort of a byproduct. It's water that's got some compounds in it, and say, for example, anthocyanins and things like that we can use. And if we combine those with the kidney bean scraps, we actually can come up with a pretty neat byproduct that will have some value and also decrease the amount of water and agricultural waste that this particular industry faces. Also with kidney beans, went through distribution centers. Again, not a lot of food waste, right? And this was specifically canned kidney beans, I should say. Retail, very little amounts of food waste, dented cans, things like that. We also have alternative retail, which is a really interesting place to spend some time on food waste, because we are seeing an increased amount of food waste at alternative retail outlets such as food shelves and food pantries. So there's a huge opportunity to reduce food waste there, about 3%. And if we go up to the consumers, boy, we've got 16% food waste. One of the neat solutions we came up with was to have can lids, reusable can lids on top of the can, so consumers could actually seal the cans readily and lock the nutrients in after they open it, and there would be less degradation, and they would be more apt to just use the can actually as a container if it's possible. That's not always possible with some compounds. So when we looked at the retail and consumer-derived food waste, we saw that it was highest. And where we really want to be when we look at food waste, not just with kidney beans, with alternative proteins and pulses, we want to be, but with other products, we want to be up in source reduction, really preventing food waste as opposed to diverting food waste into animal feed and industrial uses and composting and landfilling and incineration. So we really want to be up at the top of the APA pyramid. The second case study that was also on kidney beans. This is a work we did some time ago, and we had compared raw kidney beans to canned kidney beans. Looked at agricultural losses throughout the entire distribution system, going from farm all the way to fork, and found out that it's actually about the same for raw kidney beans and canned kidney beans. But what's different is where it actually happens. So we saw a lot of processing waste happening for dry canned and kidney beans, but then along the way, there's more food waste when it came to canned kidney beans at the consumer level. One of the interesting things from a protein perspective, from a nutrient perspective, is that nutrient waste was higher for raw kidney beans than canned beans. And that's just simply because of the nutrients within the can. More of the nutrients within the can are contained on a pound per pound basis versus in raw kidney beans and how we handle them as consumers and throughout the distribution system. From a protein perspective, the same is true. We have higher protein levels per pound of canned kidney beans versus raw kidney beans. So actually it's switched around in the graph. It's actually nutrient waste. Oh, sorry, nutrient waste is higher. Sorry, that is correct. Nutrient waste is higher for the raw kidney beans. So that's a quick summary of some case studies. What I wanted to talk to you about now is consumer and market drivers for less waste of alternative proteins. And again, it's important to take a step back that the market drivers and the economic drivers are very different for reducing food waste with alternative proteins than they are for more traditional proteins, like animal-derived proteins. And the differing drivers are due to an economic imbalance. So we see the same economic imbalance with beef and other proteins, but we don't see it in the same way. One of the interesting things is that brand owners have made major progress in economically driven food waste reduction. An example of that would be the cannery, combining the agricultural water waste with the broken kidney beans and coming up with an alternative product. And that decreases their disposal fees of water, and then it also uses their product that would normally just go to agricultural waste or animal feed to make money. And so it's an economically driven food waste reduction predominantly. Yes, they want to do the right thing and decrease their environmental impact, but the economic drive is the predominant force, at least in that case. Sometimes we do have there is very limited economic drivers to reduce the high levels of consumer-derived food waste. So when you looked at all those charts I showed you, consumer-derived derived food waste was really high. With canned kidney beans, it was around 16%. With other products, it's really high, like towards, maybe 35%. But the economic drivers to reduce consumer-derived food waste are not really there unless the consumers lead the charge. And so we need to do a better job with consumers in terms of having them invest in packaging and processing that will allow products shelf life to be extended after they've actually bought the product. But consumers do waste a lot of food. It's not necessarily their fault, but it's a lot of willingness to pay for packaging or processing that will extend the shelf life of their food. So we need to do a better job really explaining that to consumers. And so there is a gap in very clear information on what processing does for foods, and there's also a gap in terms of what packaging does for foods. Just a simple reseal feature, like peel and reseal, is not often appreciated by consumers. However, they do like Ziploc bags, which has decreased cheese waste quite a bit. One of the things we need to do, though, is really extend the value chain and our value chain analyses to consumers who waste about 30% of packaged food. So by extending the value chain down, then we can pull the system, pull food waste reduction through the entire system and have consumers really in the driver's seat of reducing food waste. But again, we need to do a better job with this in the food industry in general and specifically with pulses. We also can link convenience to adding food waste reduction. That's a big driver. We have big drivers on consumer sustainability, nutrient waste. Consumers do want those nutrients in the package. Willingness to pay for nutrient waste, less money on spoiled food. Easy to empty, interestingly, connects with consumers. And so they like products that are easy to empty out of a container. They don't like to see product that's left over in a container that they can't get out. I guess none of us do because we're all consumers. And so there's a lot of neat technologies out there that we can use for that. And we have a lot of packaging solutions that can reduce food waste, but the impetus and the business case needs to be built in order to do that. One of the things that would really help is to have some category-wide leadership and really employ system solutions. And this is something that I think the alternative protein area can really invest some time and to take a step back and rethink who needs what shelf life. We need long shelf lives in our high-speed, high-efficiency manufacturing environments because we may pack a whole bunch of one product, and then we may need that product to last throughout the entire season or sometimes even a year. But consumers don't need that type of long shelf life. We do. So we need to rethink who needs what shelf life and see some opportunities there. And there are opportunities there. And so in that case, we don't really need an extended shelf life, but the consumer needs an extended shelf life once they've opened the package. We also are seeing more system solutions and more opening up of ideas with rural versus urban specific packaging, and likewise small versus large households. We've seen that. Rural versus urban specific packaging is an opportunity to reduce the amount of packaging that we have specifically in urban areas because we really don't need as much packaging because the terms, the cycles, the buying frequency is much higher in urban areas versus rural areas. And so we can go ahead and decrease shelf lives in urban areas. And we also can do a better job of really changing the packaging that consumers handle. Consumers don't like to handle a lot of packaging, but by changing the value chain and having perhaps retailers handle more packaging or distributors handle more packaging, even reusable packaging at that level, rather than consumers having to handle packaging and then in turn our municipal recycling facilities or solid waste facilities have to handle all that packaging. So we can do a better job of tracing through the value chain in reducing the amount of packaging and doing that in a pretty smart way. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for alternative proteins in this area because they're really perceived as more environmentally friendly. And so these types of ideas, these types of concepts align with consumers that are more environmentally friendly. So we need category-wide initiatives, certainly in this category on protein waste reduction or food waste reduction and more sustainable packaging. We also can extend the value chain beyond retail to consumers, food banks, and we talked about food donations. One of the opportunities in terms of leadership is to really use the equity that we have in food service, and it's coming back even after COVID, but we see a lot of alternative proteins being used, being tested by the fast food industry and available in certain restaurants, and people try them. And that's a really wonderful means through which to guide consumers and have them just test something out. So we need to do a better job in communicating at those facilities, not that it just matches the profile of other proteins, but it may in fact be an entirely different experience. So we can work on food waste reduction at the consumer level at these specific venues and communicate that back to those consumers who are wanting to try a more sustainable type of protein. And that would be the back of house in food service and the front of house in food service. And the opportunity and the value chain drivers are higher when we connect sustainable packaging and sustainable processing to what consumers perceive as more sustainable proteins. So there's a lot of opportunities there. So I wish you could ask questions, actually, but hope to see you at the next IFT. Thank you for your time.